So this is our first guest speaker. So John Thompson, I know him since long time. In fact, I started my career in his team because I was supposed to be there as a postdoc, and finally I went there as a researcher. So I really started my first days of career, scientific career in Unibo. In fact, I was in Montpellier. John is a research director at the CEFE CNRS in Montpellier. He is expert in plant evolution, plant ecology, and he is more involved in conservation. He got more and more involved in conservation. So now he published the second edition of a very good book, I think is a must for every Mediterranean plant ecology. So it's the Mediterranean plant evolution in the Mediterranean. Now the second edition has this subtitle, Insights in Conservation, Insights for Conservation. Yeah. So, well, no, I think it's fine as presentation. I leave you the floor. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much, Marta. Because yes, it's true that in 2004 I met Giovanni Cristofolini at a conference in Valencia, and he told me he had this brilliant student who wanted to come on a postdoc. And so I waited for this brilliant student to come on a postdoc, and she arrived as a visiting scientist because she got a job before she even arrived in 2005 in our lab. So we immediately had a good drink first to celebrate that. And Marta, in 2019, she also asked me if I could participate in the ConservePlants initiative. But as she said, I wrote a new book, and I was one year away from finishing the book at the time, and I just did not have time. And I told her that if she ever needed any help, then I would be willing to participate in years to come. And so I'm very happy to be here, because I regret not being able to have participated from the start. So if I can be of any help, I was glad to come. It's always a pleasure to come to Bologna, but it's an exceptional pleasure for me to be here today. So thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to talk, I've selected a theme, which you can read on the title page, towards the conservation of evolutionary potential. And I'm going to illustrate this theme from examples on the Mediterranean flora, which are the subject of my book. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it fine at the back? Yes? Okay, good. And I hope on the Visio, yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, good. Right. So let's get going. Conservation for ecologists has two major themes, to my mind. We need to conserve a natural heritage as full as possible, as integrally as possible, for it to be able to survive. But I also feel more and more strongly, and this is an emergent theme, is that we need to integrate into the classical conservation of natural heritage scientific information on the ecological dynamics of plants, individuals, populations, communities, and the evolutionary change which stems from the ecological dynamics that we can see in nature. And it's this second point that I'm going to illustrate in my talk mostly today. I also work in my lab on the human dimensions, which will be talked about later. And if you want, after the talk, I can talk more about that. I spent half of my scientific life doing what Antonino was talking about, getting scientific information into society. I spent probably more than half my time doing that. Just on the first point, which is not the center of my talk, what I do believe is that we cannot save biodiversity with insufficient knowledge. And in the Mediterranean region, there are many areas where we need to continue inventories continue gaining knowledge of simple presence of plants in many areas which you do not know. Inventories of species, their presence and their absence, their existence, their distribution. We really need a continued and convincing dialogue to continue this investment, just in knowledge of where plants occur. This has been forgotten for many years, the importance of this theme, and it must still remain. There are many areas where our knowledge is too partial. For the heritage, we need to, and that will help us identify key biodiversity areas and continue as well with all around the Mediterranean flora, more and more knowledge on extinction risks. And that is one of your working groups, the gaps which are in this knowledge we have on extinction risks. So even though I'm not going to talk about all these aspects, the natural heritage point, I do not we should not neglect it. What I want to talk about are themes, what I'm going to talk about are themes which I believe are complementary. They're additional, which I think are important to now include. And I give this talk because I wrote this book, in which I hope I showed that we can write a real history about ecological processes and evolutionary change in the Mediterranean flora. It's one of the objectives in my mind when I started to write the book. And in writing it, I realized, because I've been working on conservation for a long, long time, in fact, my initial formation as a student was on conservation and environmental science. And I've only come back to it in the last 15 years of my career. And in writing this book, I realized that there are several themes about the ecology and evolution of Mediterranean plants which contribute to the diversity that is in the Mediterranean flora, are absent, completely absent from conservation policy. And the conservation managers often have very insufficient knowledge of ecological processes and evolutionary change. It's quite normal. They are focused on the objectives they have. And so it is perhaps time that we as scientists start trying to get the whole sphere of knowledge that we have on ecology and evolution more into conservation policy. And what I'm going to talk about is 4 themes that I've selected from what I wrote about in my book, which I feel need to be presented to conservation policy managers and those who are involved in policy. The first one is a major evolutionary process called hybridization. Second theme will be about the ecological originality of plant populations which are on the limits of species ranges. Third one, which is treated in conservation action now, but I just want to hammer it home again, because it needs to have more place than what is given, is land use change and how land use change may interact with climate change to influence plant populations and communities. And the final one is population genetic diversity. It's my HELP syndrome. Now, what I'm going to talk about is in fact not that new. If you look through the literature and go back to 1989, when I was on a postdoc at the time in Montpellier, there were papers asking to keep options alive, keep diversity and the processes that create it alive. And then also a couple of years later, what is really important for conservation is ecological gradients. I'm going to talk about this. And that in a world full of contemporary evolution, ongoing evolution, we should not forget that plants are still evolving. and that conservation policy and action should also integrate hybridization, which is a process that creates diversity. These papers have been published over the last 30, 40 years. So my first theme, hybridization. When I wrote my book, I discovered 50 clear examples of homoploid hybridization, i.e. two diploid species or of the same ploidy level hybridize and create another species of the same ploidy level. It's not polyploidy, which is even more rampant than just homoploid evolution. Of these 50 examples, 28 of them clearly have created new species in the Mediterranean flora. And another 22, the signature of the hybridization is far more recent, probably, and the hybridization is ongoing. Now, the examples cover many different genera, which I've listed here, and that sometimes you get hybridization between the same two species, but in different parts of their range. I'm going to give you an example of that. And even on one single mountain range in the Baitic Cordillera, the Sierra Nevada, ongoing hybridization has been detected in 26 groups of species out of 100, and involved 26 endemic taxa out of the 100 or so endemic species there are in this Sierra. It's a very important process in plant evolution, and I've discovered that to be so in the Mediterranean. One example that I'm going to show you is a group of species I worked on with several PhD students in Montpellier over the years. The spring flowering cyclamen. You will, from different areas around the Mediterranean in this room today, you will all know cyclamens because they flower in the autumn for some of you. They flower in Israel in the winter for those of you from Israel. But for us in the south of France, they flower in the spring. Small group of species. We have at the top right the Cyclamen repondum in the middle, which is typical spring flowering Italian species. We have in the middle Cyclamen repondum, the subspecies Peloponnesiacum in the middle. The Rhodensi, endemic to Rhodes and Kos. Creticum, endemic to Crete. This is a population. And Cyclamen balearicum, which is in the west. And during our work, we discovered that Cyclamen balearicum was not just endemic to the Balearic Islands and the south of France, as this disjunct endemic distribution. It also occurs at one site on Corsica with Cyclamen repondum. Cyclamen repondum is a plant which grows on acidic, granitic in substrates in pine forests. The Cyclamen balearicum occurs on limestone, in oak, woodland. They have very different ecologies. But on this limestone massif near Saint-Florent, in the north of Sardinia, we also find Cyclamen balearicum, where it has never been seen before, never identified before, with Cyclamen repondum, the more granitic species. So on Corsica, the red circles are Cyclamen repondum. But at one site in the north, on the limestone, you have a small percentage of white, which is the percentage of white flowers, typical of Cyclamen balearicum, and leaves as well. And at these sites, if you look at the flowers, you have Cyclamen balearicum, Cyclamen repondum, and intermediate type flowers, which represent a whole range of floral variation in one site. And when you look at the genetics of that, the white flowers are mixed at this site. Do not resemble genetically blue triangles, which are Cyclamen balearicum from its allopatric range in the Balearic Islands in the south of France. On this limestone massif, there's a whole range of genetic variability, all mixed in together in this cloud of flowers. Towards the right, you have the red. That's Cyclamen repondum, which is mixed, but it's emergent. And then the nice result in terms of the genetic diversity. When you look at parental, allopatron, repondum, and balearica, the genetic diversity here is far less than the genetic diversity of all the different floral types we get on the limestone massif, which is a mix of the genes of the two parents, but higher diversity. And what is really interesting is that I had a colleague on Sardinia, Manuel Faris, who wrote to me one day and said, John, I think we've got the same thing on Sardinia. And so we did a bit of work together and discovered the repondum, the mix, intermediate, the balearica, all hybridizing together to form mixed populations, or some just repondum populations, but exactly the same patterns of diversity on Sardinia, on limestone. And what was the interesting point, on Corsica we discovered higher genetic diversity. What we discovered in the hybrid populations on Sardinia is that we haven't got all the genetic results yet, but in terms of the abundance of the different types, we observed abundance in two ways. Either we did the abundance here by just walking around the population, put your foot, count one flower, move, count one flower, move around, count one flower, keep moving around one flower, have a population, random walk, and then put a quadrat down. It was about a 2 meter square quadrat, or I can remember rightly, 2 by 2, so 4 meter square quadrat. And there, count everything, all the flowers. When you do that, so okay, quiet. The Cyclamen balearica and the Cyclamen repondum, the parental types of flowers, there was no difference. The bisector, everything was occurring on either side or along the line. The hybrids are above the line, which means that there are relatively more flowers of hybrids in a square this big than in the whole population. So each plant is probably producing more flowers, as if they have a better vigor. So there may be this sort of evidence that could be the hybrid vigor. So either higher diversity on Sardinia or vigor on Sardinia. So a better fitness of hybrids. And this is important. For hybridization to work, you have to have the diversity and the vigor of the hybrids for them to establish. So it seems here that we're in a hybridization process which is really ongoing. And plus, if you look at the flowers, okay, if I go back, look at these flowers. That's the whole range of variation we see when we go to Crete, to Rhodes, to the Peloponnese, but it's in one site. So I feel that in our conservation dialogue that we have in society, with policy, with management, we should perhaps take a new view about hybridization. Now, cyclamen have all the wrong features to be in conservation. They're not habitats directive. They have no legal protection on Corsica or Sardinia, and they hybridize. But they do occur in sites where we could perhaps negotiate reflection on their populations, because on Corsica it's a Natura 2000 site, so perhaps we could incorporate them. And on Sardinia it's in a regional park. But let's not forget, hybridization is not a common feature of conservation policy, and often we are against it, because often hybridization is artificial. It's stemmed from an introduction or something. Here, it is natural. Perhaps the point of view, we should adapt it. My second theme, ecological originality of peripheral populations. Like hybridization, peripheral populations does not have a happy history in terms of links to conservation policy. Because peripheral populations are often small, with less genetic variability, they are neglected. But often you find there's more genetic originality in their populations because they're distant, so they evolve differently, perhaps. And also there's this sort of conservative conservation parochialism, because we have peripheral populations in a region. The most important part of the populations of these species is elsewhere, so we tend to neglect them locally. And another point is that we know very, very little about their ecology. So, why on earth am I going to talk about ecological originality? Why? Because we did a study of 11 species in France. These species have the ranges that you can see. Here are three typical ranges of the species we worked on. We have species like Stipa, which I think has changed its name since, Capensis, which occurs in 3 main sites in the south of France, the red dots, and all around North Africa, southern Spain, and southern Italy. But it is at its distribution limits in the south of France. 3 groups of peripheral populations. Polygala rupestris is a Ibero-Provençal species, which occurs a little bit towards east in the Balkans, on the Balkan coast, but 2 peripheral isolate groups in southern France. And then there's Mercantour filifolia, which has 1 group of populations in the south of France. The 11 species we studied all fit into one of these 3 situations. They occur generally around the more southern parts of the Western Mediterranean, but only very sporadically and in low abundance in the south of France. So with Guillaume Papuga as a PhD student, with Emmanuel Saris encore in Sardinia, we studied their ecology, both in the central part of the range and in the south of France, with 5 populations, 5 sites, 5 populations in either southern France in peripheral situation, or in southern Europe, southern Mediterranean, 5 populations. When we looked at these populations, in terms of their climatic distribution, they are the grey little squares, hexagon, circles. The middle, that's the peripheral population. The red is the 5 central populations, and the larger hexagon in grey is the distribution based on maps of the species. Their climatic axes, well, basically the peripheral populations are less variable in terms of their climatic axes. As you can see, they have a smaller area, both in terms of seasonality and aridity, because they are in peripheral populations that are smaller. There are fewer of them, and so less variation. And there is a slightly different climate in the south of France compared to the rest of the Mediterranean. So all these populations are Mediterranean, but the peripheral ones are a little less arid and a little cooler. But the interesting thing is that they are often in the middle. So they are not marginal, they're just less variable in terms of climatic conditions. When we looked at the broad, that's the climate. Then we went to, a little bit like this, the broad habitat in which they occur. Each of the letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. K is a species. CMP, a central and peripheral. So if you come down this column, species A occurs in Mediterranean and European communities on shallow soil, both in central and peripheral populations, the green band. The same. This species occurs in this type of community, central and peripheral. Central and peripheral, central and peripheral. First 4 species occur in exactly the same broad habitats, central part of their range and in the periphery. This one as well, this one as well, this one as well. Even these, all the species occur the same. And there's just a few of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, have a slight variation in peripheral populations in terms of their broad habitat. But very little difference in terms of the broad habitat. However, when we looked at the micro niche of the species, and this is something I worked on a lot in Montpellier, and if you want I can talk to you about it later, the niche which is observed where plants actually grow, i.e. in a 1 meter square around them, or a 4 meter square if there are bigger plants. If you look at the conditions, and for example, on a 1 meter square quadrat that I have up on the left top, you do every little square, you do a point, and for every little 1 meter square, you get 100 points for the presence of bare soil, litter, rocks, stones, other species. And you look at the niche with that data, and when you put that data onto a little table here and put the colors, so you have the same species from A to K. And you look at different biotic variables, numbers of species, the richness of species, the percentage of annuals and perennials, the percentage of small woody plants, or the abiotic cover in terms of rocks, soil, the rocks, the litter, etc., in terms of the percentage, or the real soil parameters, pH, carbon, nitrate, carbon rates, organic matter retention of water. Put a color on when there's a difference. Either it's higher in peripheral populations than in central populations in blue, either it's lower in central populations in orange compared to peripheral. Now look at this. The colors are everywhere. For the micro niche, all we did was detect differences between this species. Look how many variables it was different compared to central and peripheral. This species, this one. Nearly all of them, and this species, I think, showed few differences. For where plants grow, we pick up many differences. So and the most important ones, which are very common across the species, are here. In terms of pH, in terms of bare soil, rocks and stones, typical elements of endemic Mediterranean plants, by the way, or litter and species richness. We could very often the same coming up, and others less of it. So we could always have this syndrome of peripheral populations going in the same direction, often as well in the same direction. So not for climate, not for broad habitat, but for the micro niche where plants grow, we have a certain ecological originality of peripheral populations. And this is interesting because there are many theories about speciation, and one of them is that what you call budding speciation, where in peripheral populations, because of ecological originality, you can get evolution, even in contact. And we know that for some of the parameters that we studied in this study, that it fits with the narrow endemic, the sort of persistence niche of endemic species in the Mediterranean. Which leads us on and on and on to think that, well, aren't these peripheral populations evolving populations, perhaps incipient species, as Darwin would have called them? And perhaps, like hybrids, they should become more apparent when we start talking about conservation of local populations, species. And some of these peripheral populations are in the situation that I call only one. There's only one left. There's only one there now. Species of the region that are in a peripheral situation and really on the brink of extinction, where you need to act urgently and positively with reinforcement, reintroduction to remediate their vulnerability. And one of them in our study areas is an iris, Spanish iris, Iris zifia, which goes down the Catalonian coast. And there's only one single population in the south of France, for which we formed a reinforcement program, which has been going on for about 10 years now. At one single site, it's in a marshland area. Here's some photos of the site. We studied its ecology. It's in a marsh area, but in fact, in the marsh area, you won't find it with the Salicornia. You'll find it here with Shoilus nigricans, perhaps some Phragmites as well, because in fact it doesn't like salt water too much. It's in salt marshes that are not too salty. And we've been monitoring and working with local people. Now, we've been following this for several years. In many good years, the natural population in blue can be very high, up to 2,000 flowers at the site, almost. And so in these years, like in 2008, the natural population is very high compared to the colors at the top. The colors at the top are the different sites where we reintroduced the iris. So in a year like 2018, which is a really good year for the plant, the natural population is good, and you see the colors, which are the numbers of flowers in our transplanted zone. In 2017, an intermediate year, and 2016, before that, was a bad year for the plant. 2016, we had very few flowers in the blue color. So the natural population is very small. For that year, they didn't flower very much. So in a bad year, our introduced experiment represented the majority of flowers in the site. So already it's contributing to the dynamics in 2016. But over the years, because we've now been studying it for 10 years, at the top, it's numbers of flowers in the natural population over the years. And you can see 2012 was an intermediate year, 2013 was a very good year, lots of flowers. 2014 was a bad year for the natural population. 2015 a good year, 2016, as I just showed you, a bad year. You see the wave going on and on. We've had a very bad year this in 2021. It's like the natural population goes like that. And the reintroduced has declined and then sort of plateaued off and then declined again. You can see it's sort of a plateau here in 2017, 2018, the reintroduced. So they declined originally, which we expected. We put in many and usually you have a decline when you start. Then it plateaued off for the good years and it's gone down again for the bad years. And in fact, when we've looked at it more precisely, we have a sort of a wave going on in our introduced. So the bad years are not necessarily bad, they're just following what's happening in the natural situation. And what is kind of nice is that after 6 years, we have colonization around the sites where we reintroduced the plant. So the plants we reintroduced have finally got out and are recolonizing. So in fact, this that, the middle one, to show exactly what is happening. So in fact, it's taken us nearly 10 years to realize that if you do this sort of experiment to reintroduce plants, the most important thing to do is to study it for at least 10 years. And also, we could only start talking about success if this occurs. This is the most important thing on a reintroduction program. There are dynamics. It's spreading. And it's interesting because it's the only site in France where this plant occurred. The landowners didn't realize that. It's actually the Natural Conservancy for the coastal areas in France. And the management staff didn't realize it was the only site in France where this plant occurs. So already we were able to bring this knowledge to them that, they have a unique responsibility. And with that unique responsibility, we've learned that we need to know the ecology, we need to do the study for a long-term basis, and you must compare with the natural. You must have a control. Many reintroduction projects don't have a control, and then they conclude that it didn't work. But how do they know it didn't work? And also, we need to work together with the management staff to get the knowledge to them, and then manage the area with them. And we've set up with the management staff, there's now a big board at the site so that people don't come and collect these beautiful flowers, that it's quite rare, in fact. You shouldn't collect a bouquet to take home on Sunday lunchtime. It's also the Mediterranean, so it's very lots of tourism. So to bring this knowledge into the local people and the tourists who come. And in addition, we contacted the local school, a small town between Montpellier and Béziers. And each year, the school teacher would bring the primary school children who actually set up 3 transects of reintroduced plants, and they've been coming back with us each year and monitoring how well their experiment is going with their school. Getting our science into society. Third point, land use change and also climate. There's a figure from my book. I think that the real and important effects of climate change can only really be assessed if they are done in relation to how human populations are impacting directly via land use change plant populations. In the Mediterranean, the climate has always changed. It's now, of course, going much faster, but also in situations where human activities have reduced the size and fragmented populations to a great extent, particularly in the coastal areas. And if you look at the south of France, from Perpignan to Montpellier, which is a big red thing in the middle, Marseille, and up to Côte d'Azur, Nice, and you have green, yellow, and red. Green is the backcountry, not too severely impacted. Yellow is mostly agricultural areas, and red, of course, urbanized, train lines, roads, factories, etc. So there's a generalized situation of increasing vulnerability in the region where we work in, which is typical of most Mediterranean coastal countries. For 6 species that we looked at, it's the same area, Endemic is the south of France, still here, Perpignan to Saint-Tropez. We studied 6 species just to give us a bit more information on this pattern, what's happening for plants. Annual species, perennial species, geophytes, Allium, Chrysanthemum, Bogus, Cypercapensis in the middle, Ononium species. Very different biologies. A couple of annuals, several perennial species. We've studied their demography for about 10 to 12 years in a range of populations. And we also looked at their generalized vulnerability in terms of the land use around the sites that all their populations occur in, the degree of fragmentation, the degree of protection that is accorded to the sites. And nearly all these species show the same pattern. If you add on, if you build up a score of vulnerability based on these 3 criteria, like 2 points if it's poor land use, 2 points if it's fragmented, 2 points if it's not in a protected area, etc. like this, you get a vulnerability score. And you can see that the populations, the numbers of populations are all biased towards the right, to high vulnerability scores. A little bit less species, but in general, there's high vulnerability around the Mediterranean for these species. And we studied the populations, we studied a range of populations of each species, studied every year 10 or 11 years. And we've detected cumulative impacts on the populations in terms of garbage disposal, all sorts of impacts, which are such that that more than 20 populations that we studied have been impacted or destroyed in 10 years. And the monitoring of 32 of these populations shows a demographic decline over the 10 years, particularly in the perennial species. The annuals are very variable and the perennials are more stable, but the stability is a slight decline. So, and basically, and we've been looking at more and more species over and above these 6 species over the last few years. I've come to the conclusion that for many Mediterranean species, we are trying to conserve species in human-dominated landscapes, fragmented, degraded because of wetland species in polluted temporary pools. And the management staff are taking on conservation management in a situation that all they're striving to do is to try and make the habitats as optimal as possible. And this question that I'm faced with very often when I'm with people in the non-academic world is that can we have a dialogue which convinces people to preserve species when they occur in such degraded habitats? You take them to the field and, oh my God, how can I argue for the conservation of these plants? They're in such degraded situations. So it's not only the demographic problem for the plants, the problem for us who want to achieve this a convincing conservation dialogue. And the last theme, which is probably the most obvious, is population diversity. 2 examples of population diversity in Mediterranean plants. Cyclamen balearicum, I can't give a talk without talking about cyclamens. Cyclamen balearicum populations in the south of France, 45% of them, the variability occurs among sites. Sites are all different from one another in the south of France. At lunchtime, we were talking about Mediterranean islands and how different volcanic islands are compared to continental islands in terms of the species area relationships and other things, with the example of the Aeolian Islands. But even the continental islands of the Mediterranean are different compared to other areas of the world because they're continental fragments. They often show patterns which are more similar to the continents than islands elsewhere. And what we discovered when we did Cyclamen balearicum was the genetic differentiation among populations in the south of France is much higher than the differentiation among different islands in the Balearic, and notably the Balearic Islands. There's more differentiation among these populations in southern France than among populations which occur on Minorca, Mallorca, and Ibiza. Probably because of the history of human impacts on the populations in southern France, which have been much greater until recently than those on the Balearic Islands. The contrary of what we would have expected on theoretical basis. And then another example is the spatial genetic structure of Gentiana ligustica in the southern Maritime Alps, where my colleagues from Marseille, Caterpillar and Frédéric Médaille, were able to describe different genetic types in different valleys of the southern Maritime Alps due to the history of glaciation in that region, with marked genetic differentiation on a very localized scale. Marked population diversity. The most important thing about writing a book is that you learn a lot. As you all know, as soon as you start to write about a subject, you learn something. You learn more about the subject than you actually knew. It's the same thing for every chapter of my book. In chapter 7, when I started looking at genetic diversity of endemic species, I've been working on Cyclamen balearicum for nearly more than 30 years, in fact. I started discovering that what we saw in Cyclamen balearicum 30 years ago was the same in many, many, many narrow endemic species. I got 98 published studies of genetic variation in endemic plants. I searched and searched to get 2 more, but never found them. So I stayed with 98. Now, for these 98 species of endemic species, of the 62 species which are narrow endemics, 48 of them showed significant genetic variability within their population. And for the disjunct endemic species like Cyclamen balearicum, which is endemic to the west Mediterranean, but occurs in south of France in the Balearic, so it's sort of a disjunct endemism. 28 of the 36 species like this one showed significant levels of within population variability. And when you look at the genetic differentiation among the populations, like I showed you for Gentiana and Cyclamen balearicum, well, the same. The majority, 42 out of 60 narrow endemic species, 28 of 36 disjunct endemic species, high levels of genetic differentiation among populations. I learned in writing the chapter 7 in my book that endemic species are genetically variable. They are not because of their low distribution. No, they still show a lot of variability. There's a lot of population diversity. Now, when you look at protected areas, for example, in continental Spain for plants, of 1,609 threatened species, 581 of them occur in at least one population in a national park, and the majority of species occur in at least one Natura 2000 site. Several have management plans, etc. In Mediterranean France, similar pattern. Half of them occur inside regulatory control, like a national park. And then 580 of the 600 species occur in at least one Natura 2000 site. Sounds good, but I put it in bold. At least one. When you really look at the data, well, here's the example from the south of France. On the top graph, the number of species which occur in no site with the protection, the zero. 45 of the 100 and I can't remember, 106, I think, species. Then 60 species. And you see almost 60 species occur in at least one site, and then it goes down. The numbers which occur in 2 or 3 or 4, and way down. So in fact, the at least one is the most common. Only one. Then the zeros, which make up 80% of all species, in fact, and only a few, in fact, occur in more than one. We're not protecting diversity. And when we do, they occur in Natura 2000 sites. Now, I don't know how that works in Italy, but in France, a legally protected species by the law does not necessarily have a management plan, even if it occurs in a Natura 2000 site. It's often neglected, like my iris zipium, I didn't even know it. So at least in France and probably in many other countries, we have to think about how to get this population diversity, which actually does occur more in Natura 2000 and elsewhere, into these management plans. And also start thinking about these zeros and these ones to get them in more sites. We do not protect population diversity in Mediterranean plants. And all the species in my study are protected, legally protected species. We are not protecting their diversity. And yet know now that they are diverse. So one way would be to, as I say here, protect species. There are others just for the diversity in terms of species, the concept of micro-reserves, which our colleagues in Spain developed for the Valencia region, which could be a useful tool. It's been criticized, this approach, because they originally started on species variation and other aspects. But if you limit this approach just to collect the patches of diversity, then perhaps it could be a useful tool. There's been studies in the Liban as well. And the last little point is population diversity on ecological gradients. This is wild kind. Okay. It's this the region of here, where we work, which is mapped here. With the black circle, this zone here, it's a mountain you can see behind, where you have black square circles all around, mountains around. And in this valley, the circles are yellow. That's because in the valley, the yellow circles are chemical types, which are non-phenolic chemical types, which have monoterpenes, acyclic monoterpenes like linalool, geraniol, thionol, alpha-terpineol, and these types of molecules. And the black circles are phenolic chemical types, which have a benzene circle, thymol and carbachol, notably. So they don't have the same distribution in chemical types. The phenolic types we found through our experiments have high drought resistance with a low tolerance of cold. Whereas the non-phenolics in the bottom, in the valley, they have a low drought resistance with a high tolerance of winter freezing. In the valleys are actually cold. The valley is actually colder than the outskirts, and they are on deeper soils as well. If you look at the photo, you can see the outskirts is rocky, typical garrigue, whereas in the bassin, in the valley, it's more agricultural, and the soils are deeper. Now, if you look at the temperatures for this region for the last 65 years. The blue line is where the non-phenolic types occur, which tolerate winter freezing. And the red line is where the phenolic chemotypes occur, which have a low tolerance of freezing. So, the red chemotypes occur in the sites which have a red line, and the blue non-phenolics where the blue line. Okay, so we've charted the minimum winter temperature each year since the late 1950s. We know that if you plant phenolic chemotypes in non-phenolic sites where you can have a minimum winter temperature of less than -15, they cannot survive. Our experiments, both by putting plants in the fridge, by transplanting experiments between environments with reciprocal transplants. But if you transplant phenolic chemotypes with a non-phenolic habitat, they cannot survive the low winter temperatures. What's happening to the temperatures? As you can see, -6, -2. These were the 2 years that the olive groves were wiped out in the south of France. Minimum winter temperatures down to -2. During the 1960s and 1970s, there were frequently winter temperatures here, which dropped below -15. And in the last 30 years, the winter temperatures have barely ever gone down below -10. So the climate has changed in terms of winter cold. Summers aren't very different. We've just had 1 or 2 summers that are a little bit higher than normal. So we resampled this map. In the middle is the blue, really cold winters once upon a time, until the 1970s. And this map was drawn in 1975, okay? 1975. Following this period. We recycled here in 2009 and 2010. We couldn't do all the 300 populations that my colleagues did in the early 1970s. But we did 6 transects, which are the red arrows, from black to yellow. So it's from red to blue, in fact. Phenolics and non-phenolics. We took. Probably it's on the next slide. Yes. We took 2 populations on each of the 6 transects, 12 phenolic populations on the outside, 12 yellow ones in the middle on the 6 transects, and 12 in the middle, where you had a little bit of a mixture. Okay? 12, 36 populations were initially happening. Resample purposes, 2009 and 2010. For the 12 populations which are phenolic, the black here, as on the maps, the black and yellow, no change. They were still phenolic, at 100%. For the mixed populations, the frequency of black chemotypes, phenolic, increased to a point that in some populations they were no longer mixed, they were phenolic. And for the yellow populations, the non-phenolics, some of them have stayed non-phenolic without a change, but others are now mixed. And globally, it's become a mix. The times are changing, and they're all changing in the same direction towards black outsiders who are coming down into the valley. In fact, they're appearing, in fact. It's more, we're learning that it's more local adaptation probably than migration. So climate's changing, time's changing, and all this evolutionary change on this ecological gradient occurs within a Natura 2000. But they don't apparently know about the chemotypes and the variation, nor our publications on the effect of climate change. So we are starting to work with the conservation managers to show that this is a wonderful site to teach people about plant evolution. We have an bioindicator species of climate change. And this is important. The Mediterranean flora is full of aromatic plants. And when I wrote my book, I learned that what we see in thymus can be seen in many, many species, which within species variation in relation to climatic conditions, in terms of what chemotype, what genetic type of production of chemical compounds in many species. And that even some Spanish colleagues have already 4 or 5 years ago argued that these are units for conservation. But at the end of my chapter where I talked about aromatic plants, I could find no example of what they are asking for. So the heritage, I believe, needs help. Hybrids, ecological originality, land use change with climate, and population diversity. And to argue more, with a message about the farm, that biodiversity is not static, it's evolving, and we need to preserve the potential for evolution. That's it. Thank you. Come.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. And I have a question about the hybrids. And we're struggling with the question. We have endangered species that is very rare and common species. And in some places we can see a hybrid situation. And you can see the combination of the endangered species. So do you think every hybrid operation is self-management?
No.
Do you think the same natural?
No, what I'm saying is that there are situations where hybrid populations should be taken into concern for the debate on conservation about hybrids. But obviously, I don't believe that should be applied to all situations. The situation that was studied in Sontoria, I think, in northern Spain by Pujol, northern Spain, is a bit like what you're talking about. On the Balearic Islands, they have the same type of problem for the reintroduction of Narinaria species, I think. It's very similar to what you're talking about. And there you have to work for, in some areas, at least for the distribution of your endangered species to maintain the pure populations as well. But perhaps at the same time, if possible, in some areas, leave evolution going on to see what happens. It may not even have any positive effect. So keep, it's the same thing, keep the options alive. So do some management in some areas to prevent, and let perhaps in some areas hybridization go on to observe.
Thank you, Don. I think you can hear.
Yes.
So many questions, so I will make 2 or 3 around the region. I hope you join the meeting later. Now, so thank you for the nice talk for the third. I also the big challenge, decades of conservation, there perception of potential. Some potentiality for evolutionary part, but also ecological part.
Yes.
We're working on a certificate of we focus on plants and also communities and ecosystem. And I got the same result. In my mind, we need a certain space for ecological processes. What is disappearing everywhere is space for natural processes.
Yeah.
So, my question, after these evolutionary processes you develop, that you should develop the natural processes, natural landscape.
Yes.
And they were also favored in my mind.
Yeah.
So, you have an idea which is a good mixture between human modified landscape as the most natural 1,000 landscape, for example, or living parts of the complete natural processes. You have any idea of the future of your mind. Then I have a second question. The second question is introduction of species. Is it usually considered all last name? But it's open new evolution.
Yeah. Yes, that's true.
Give some words.
Yeah.
About some other questions.
Yeah. Well, on the first one, the compromise, I think you can only do the compromise on a case-by-case study. It's a bit like what I just replied to on the previous question. I strongly believe that in some areas of the Mediterranean, we should let things go, leave natural, free, ecological dynamics, so that we can observe that in natural situations where the effects of human impacts are low. Just for our general knowledge of how biodiversity in general, not just plants, evolves. So I'm a bit of an advocate of this free evolution in some areas. But obviously a lot of the Mediterranean has been, nearly everything in the Mediterranean has been touched by human beings over the last 10,000 years. So we are there, we're in it already. So if we continue, I think what we have to, it's a dialogue between us as to what we really want to preserve and where we want to preserve what we want to preserve. So it's a dialogue which has to be done on a case-by-case study in many areas. But at some point, there's a level where I think we must let things evolve naturally. And that's what I was saying to you for your hybrids. In some areas, let it go. It might teach us something in years to come about how these processes work and whether or not they really are as important as what John Thompson said in 2021 at the conference in Bologna. Perhaps I'm exaggerating, and I exaggerate because I want to get messages across. But in some areas, we have to limit things, that's for sure, and we have to manage as well. There are many situations where, like for our iris, things have become so fragile that we have to put a stimulus for it to evolve naturally. It can't evolve naturally in the current situation. It's just not enough present, and we don't have enough space. So we modified completely what's happening in the iris situation in its population. And so perhaps, as you say, in some areas, well, we should keep the management, very important management going on, like in Natura 2000 sites. But they need to be, I think, we just have to get away in these sites from just the lists of protected species that are given to the people. It's an ecosystem that they should be managing, and thus integrating new questions on that ecosystem. And I think that's the most important point for the moment, is to be getting these ideas about community and population dynamics into management plans. And the second question was introductions. Yes, yeah, but it's the same thing. There are many introductions that we haven't stopped, and to eradicate would be very, very difficult. So I think the most important thing is to keep the observations and surveillance of these sites going, so that we have a better idea about for how long do these introduced species have an impact? Because it may well be that many of them will decline over time. Once their parasites and pathogens arrive as well, then they should decline and just become a part of something. And it's very difficult in the Mediterranean because humans have moved the plants around the Mediterranean. So we have Mediterranean plants being moved around the Mediterranean despite their ancestral endemism. And getting the message across about these species. You know, people believe they are Mediterranean and don't understand that we want to regulate some species, because we know the fine details about their ancestral distribution. And that's not easy for many people to understand. So, but for introductions, if we can minimize, I think it's a priority. The priority is newly introduced species, which haven't completely dominated ecosystems. Yes. Okay. There's Philippos.
Can I ask you?
Oh, go on.
Sure. So my name is Phila Rabanopoulos. I'm a professor of genetics working with perennial plants. Thanks very much for this great talk. You made a very convincing argument for the consideration of evolutionary potential in plant conservation. My question is, though, why the international community would not consider using genetic diversity and evolutionary potential among its criteria for conservation? We see the CBD discussion going on, and anything related to evolutionary genetics has not really become part of the criteria that are being studied. We are still looking for species diversity, as that is enough in this era of climatic change. Would you have a comment on this, please?
The only comment I can really make on that is that people have not been educated to integrate diversity within species, where everything in plant conservation has been either focalized on a phytosociological approach with Natura 2000 or a species approach. It's been like that. That is the way we transmit information. The IUCN red lists are about species. They're great. We need them for media and everything. And it's up to us who have the finer knowledge of the importance of diversity within this species to start trying to influence how we write the policies, perhaps, or how we now strive towards the loss of biological diversity. That the level of within species is as important as the level between species, because of the way environments are changing and the need for plants and animals to either adapt or migrate in relation to those changes. And the only way to adapt is that there is enough diversity in the populations to be able to adapt. We need to get together and formulate some very simple messages on this theme. Perhaps species is a simple message. People identify plants. We have lists of names of plants. Now we have to have a simple message about what is important in evolution, diversity and dynamics genetic diversity and ecological dynamics.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, I'll read the question. Dear John, do you think that sooner or later EU conservation policy will be updated in terms of integrating genetic diversity? So far, everything is still centered on the unflexible concept of biological species. That sounds much like the same question, which is deeply problematic for the reasons you emphasize. So the question is, will EU conservation policy be updated? I hope so, because it needs to be. But at the same time, the EU what we talk about today should be seen as something complementary. I'm not against the EU conservation policy. It's been a fabulous, positive step towards preserving plant communities and plant species around Europe. The question is how we change the lists of species and how we adapt to the fact that when we talk about representativity, which is the essential word in the EU European Union conservation policy, representative habitats, well, look, we have representative samples, species in these habitats as well. Simple message. But it's no reason to stop doing the EU conservation policy. It's not a criticism. What I'm asking, what I'm talking about is taking new and positive steps forward.
I did a very interesting moment. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I was really investigating the ecology in the role of Speciation. We have the necessity to improve the ecological perspective, moving from individuals and reaching to the system. Because it's playing roles in the system. And when we talking about space, the species, we have to think that the space is not an empty room. It's a room that is filled by other species that live together in those and often my perspective is from our systems. Often there are no energy levels or the energy inside the systems are not that to the rest of the species. So we need to put more layers in our perspective, not only incorporation individuals, but also at a higher level of organization that are ecosystems and and in the past, large perspective is the house of the large part of the distribution by biodiversity.
No, I totally agree. The lack of interest for species interactions and ecosystem processes, I can only agree with you. And I do talk about this in my book, species which are which drive the ecological dynamics locally. Keystone species, I mentioned quite a few examples in my book. And in fact, when I give another talk, which is not this one, which is about all sorts of different themes, I just don't have time in this talk I keep my talks focused on ecology, evolution, species for the moment. But in this, my example of time, when I just talk about time, I talk about this species, which is common species. It's neglected from all conservation policy. What I want is to get this common species into conservation management for Natura 2000s. So there, I start talking about how this species drives interactions with other species. Because when biology produces all these secondary compounds, if you try to plant species, the shadow of these, you take the soils from here, and you plant and grow, try to grow other species. on the soils that are modified by the secondary compounds of the leaves when they fall into the soil. We get very interesting results on how this modifies ecosystem competency. So I do sometimes talk about what you are. Just note today I was already too long.
Thank you very much. I think we are running a little bit late.
Yeah, well, thank you for your attention, and I'm here for the next 2 days. So.